Imagine this. Nearly 200 billion euros of Russian money is frozen in Europe. And Brussels is now asking, what if we use that money to fund Ukraine, but without technically touching it? Sounds sneaky, right? Well, that's exactly the creative plan the EU just floated, and it could change the financial game of this war. Ever since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the West has been sitting on a mountain of frozen Russian assets. We're talking hundreds of billions locked up, gathering dust. But here's the catch. Legally, Europe can only use the interest those assets generate, not the massive sums themselves. And honestly, the interest is peanuts compared to Ukraine's needs. So the question is, how do ye help Ukraine without breaking international law? Enter the European Commission's latest brainwave. Instead of grabbing the Russian money outright, they're suggesting a workaround. Swap the frozen assets for EU-backed IOUs. Yeah, IOUs, or in fancy economic terms, zero-coupon EU bonds. Here's how it would work. Euroclear, the Brussels-based financial giant that holds most of these Russian assets, transfers the maturing funds into the European Central Bank. Normally, that just sits there and collects interest. But under this proposal, the EU would replace that cash with bonds. Basically, we'll pay you later, promise, and then use the freed up money to give Ukraine what it desperately needs right now. Sounds clever? Or too clever? Let's dig deeper. See, the biggest headache has always been legality. Directly seizing Russia's assets could spark endless lawsuits, accusations of theft, even retaliation against Western holdings abroad. Brussels knows that risk. That's why this plan is being described as legally creative. And here's the kicker. Ukraine wouldn't even need to repay this money until Russia itself coughs up war reparations. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made that clear in her State of the Union speech. She basically said, Ukraine gets the money now. Russia will foot the bill later. That's a pretty bold statement. Let's not forget what's on the line here. Ukraine faces a massive €8 billion budget shortfall next year. Cities are shattered. Infrastructure is broken. Every euro counts, not just for the battlefield, but for keeping the lights on and hospitals running. Meanwhile, the EU has already helped pay back its share of a €45 billion G7 loan using the interest from these frozen assets. But that pot of interest, it's running dry. Ukraine needs something bigger, something faster. Of course, nothing in Brussels ever moves without roadblocks. For this scheme to fly, every EU country has to sign off. And we're talking unanimity here. One no vote and the whole thing collapses. Plus, Belgium and Euroclear have been waving red flags for months. Their warning? If ye start playing too loosely with Russian money, ye risk legal trouble. And let's be real, the last thing the EU wants is to hand Moscow a legal victory. So yes, it's a balancing act. Bold enough to help Ukraine, careful enough to stay inside the legal lines. Think about the irony here. Russia's money, sitting frozen in Europe, could end up bankrolling the very war effort meant to defeat Moscow's invasion. That's poetic justice, if it works. But if the plan backfires legally, it could look like the West bent its own rules. And that's exactly the narrative the Kremlin wants. So the EU's walking a razor's edge. Justice versus legality. Creativity versus chaos. Now, I've got to ask ye, do ye think this plan is genius, finding a loophole to make Russia pay? Or is it a dangerous gamble that could backfire? Because here's the reality. For Ukraine, every delay in funding is costly. And for Europe, every misstep is political dynamite. So here we are, 200 billion euros locked up, a war that shows no signs of ending, and a creative idea that could either rewrite the rules or blow up in Brussels' face. What do ye think? Should the EU go ahead with this bond swap plan, or is it a slippery slope? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if you found this breakdown helpful. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into stories shaping our world. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought on the battlefield, but in the vaults of Europe's banks.